right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's program. My name is Leah Desher. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for DHPSNY. Before we dive into things, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping notes to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. And so the teach-in portion of this program is going to be recorded, but our conversations after those teach-ins are not going to be recorded. And those recordings will be available on our YouTube as well as sent out to all registrants within the next week or so with any additional resources that we come up with today. So I'm going to kick things off by sharing a little bit about the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York program, as well as our work with ARIA Strategies. So DHPSNY, as we like to call ourselves, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this dialogue series. So if you'd like to learn more about any of our services, you can check us out at dhpsny.org. So now, to situate this particular program within the larger context of work being done at the state level, the State Education Department is overseen by the New York State Board of Regents, and in April of 2021, the Board of Regents offered their framework on diversity, equity, and inclusion in New York schools, and subsequently issued their culturally responsive sustaining education framework. So this series of programs that DHPSNY is doing is an effort on behalf of the State Archives and State Library to extend the work of the Board of Regents into the cultural heritage community and address these issues in the context of collecting organizations across the state. So because DHPSNY is sort of positioned as a resource and a connector for cultural heritage organizations throughout New York, we've recognized that it's important for our efforts to be more actively engaged in doing and fostering anti-racism work within this field. So for this reason, we've been working with ARIA Strategies for a couple of years now to get a sense of what type of work our constituents are already doing and where folks like you around the state are interested in further developing their learning. So ARIA Strategies is a firm that provides mission-driven solutions for nonprofits. It's based in Rochester, New York. And like I said, DHPSNY has been working with them for a few years now to produce anti-racism content for collecting institutions. So we're really grateful to have ARIA here today facilitating this program. So with all of that, I'm going to pass things over to ARIA to set the space for us. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Aaliyah. Hey, everybody. It's so good to be together. I'm Aria, and I just want to say thank you so much to the folks at DHPSNY and the New York State Library and New York State Archives for making this programming possible. I'm really excited to dive into Undertold stories with you today. And I'm really excited to continue our conversation into 2025 about anti-racism for collecting organizations. So like Leah said, my consulting practice is located in Rochester, New York. We work all over, but call Rochester home. And I work with a team of really cool operational staff as well as consulting staff that help develop how we're going to approach this work together. Our 2025 theme is Collections for the Future of New York, and our guiding question this year is, what can we as practitioners in the field, both paid and volunteer, do to build and steward collections for the communities of tomorrow? As we get into our conversation today, I'd love it if you shared in the chat your name, your organization, if you'd like to, your location, and let us know what you're hoping to get from this session as we dig into making the invisible visible. Also, at some point, Leah will put an evaluation link in the chat, and we really, really love it when you tell us what went well and what could have gone better and what you're looking forward to in future programs. Before we get started with our presentations and our dialogue, we're going to start with agreements and norms. This gives us the opportunity to make sure everybody is on the same page, make sure there's no secret language or secret handshake, and everybody can participate fully. So we developed these agreements and norms way back in 2022 at our very first program together. And so we start with lead with love, understand this is a journey, drop the mic, step up, step back, speak for yourself, inhabit the values of inclusion, respect, and mutual positive regard, Use direct communication, come to the space teachable, open your mind, really listen, stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, expect and accept non-closure, ask questions in the chat or message us directly, be responsible for what you hear, use I statements, assume best intent, and most importantly, love each other into education. Today's structure is going to be one of interactive, large and small group conversations. We're going to build community, share information, engage in discussion and debrief, and we're going to make plans for the future. We'll also hear from practitioners in the field and learn from their expertise. I want you to ask questions and get comfortable with discomfort. You can expect to feel curious, frustrated, heard, confused, and surprised. Our objective today is to question and identify whose stories are missing from our collections, discern which of our contemporary communities are visible and which are invisible, and build in mechanisms to keep vulnerable communities safe while still collecting materials that tell their stories. As always, we create an anonymous question catcher for this program. We invite you to add your questions to it for discussion later in the session. The reason we do this is sometimes we have a question that might be a sensitive topic, or we might not have the confidence to lift it up ourselves vocally, or we might not want people to know who we are or which organization we're talking about. And so you can pop your questions into that, and then I'll pull them out during our Q&As today. And I think Leah just put the link in the chat. We're going to start off today with some introductions. We are going to do a little mini webinar that is recorded, and that'll be in 2 or 3 sections so that we have plenty of time for questions. We'll do some small and large group conversations, which are not recorded. Lots of opportunity for questions at the end of the program as well. And then we'll talk about some next steps and action items. Where are we? In New York. Today, we are going to hear from folks from Syracuse University, which is a higher education institute in an urban environment. And we're also going to hear from somebody from CUNY, the City University of New York, which is also a higher education institution and also in an urban community. So I am going to toss the mic to Jessica Terry Elliott and ask her to give a brief introduction. And then we're going to go in alphabetical order, reverse by last name. So it'll go Jessica Terry Elliott, Jessica Murray, and then Caroline Charles. And that's how we'll do introductions. Okay, guys? All right, Jessica Terry Elliott, I'm going to toss the mic to you too.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me. So my name is Jessica Terry Elliott. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Syracuse University, currently in the throes of writing a couple more chapters for my dissertation, which primarily focuses on archival repositories and the conversations that they have with domestic repositories, kind of trying to get a more holistic view of what times and events actually look like when you put into conversation various types of documents, or when you use different types of methodologies to understand particular periods or events in time. I'm a native of Syracuse, so this work for me is more so personal and academic. It is a melding of the two. It is kind of one of the ways in which I choose to do research. I don't disjoint my personal from my academic. I feel like you get a more, you get a better sense of what research can look like, and you get a better sense of how you kind of understand the world when you are fully focused on the things that you love and finding out ways to learn more about the things that you love through different modes of research. So I think that is it. So Aria, I am passing the mic to Jessica Murray. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Murray. I'm a project consultant for the New York City Disability Rights Archive. I earned my PhD in developmental psychology at the Graduate Center CUNY in 2020. And I've been working in the Department of Faculty Affairs for CUNY on a part-time basis, working on faculty training around disability and accessibility issues. I came to this project because I'm also an activist, and I was working on transportation accessibility activism in New York City. And I'll explain more in my presentation, but it's been really enlightening to kind of see the breadth of disability rights activism here in New York City, and just really excited to be part of this project, and very grateful to have the support of DHPSNY. And I'll pass it on to Caroline.
Caroline, you are muted.
So very quickly, Caroline Charles is also a PhD candidate at Syracuse University. Her home is within the Department of English, and she and I have collaborated on this project and other projects in the past. But that is just a quick introduction of who she is. She's so much more complex and so brilliant in so many capacities. So when she comes back, hopefully we can hold space for her to introduce herself fully.
Thank you, Jessica, for that. We definitely can.
Thank you.
Thanks to our co-facilitators for giving us just the very quick introduction to themselves. The mini webinar gives us the opportunity to create a common foundation for our conversation with each other later in the session. We'll have the opportunity to sort of ask questions and grapple with who has been intentionally excluded and identify strategies to engage them. And this mini webinar also will give us examples that help us make plans for the future with those stakeholders at the center of our plans. And just as a reminder, it's recorded. So I'm going to turn the mic back over to Jessica Murray and ask her to go ahead and tell us all about the New York City Disability Rights Archive. And Jessica, just so you know, I'm the one controlling the slides, so you can just let me know when it's time to move the slides forward, okay?
Okay, sounds good. So hello again. Yes, the New York City Disability Rights Archive is a project based at the College of Staten Island, CUNY. The College of Staten Island has some historical significance because it is on the grounds of the former Willowbrook State School, which was the largest congregate facility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities before it was closed down. There was an expose by Geraldo Rivera in the early 70s, and it took another 15 years for them to move the 6,000 people out of that facility into group homes after the closure. And yeah, so that now the College of Staten Island is in the same buildings there. And so it's, you know, they've tried to grapple with some of their history and launched something called the Willowbrook Mile, which has, you know, you can kind of walk around this it's a really massive campus based in New York City because, you know, they have a lot of space out there. But you can walk around and see these different markers that explain some of the history of the site. And the archive itself, it grew out of a lack of documentation of key events and activism that took place in New York City. You know, I'll explain a little bit on the next slide, but it was really initiated by longtime activists who have been doing activism in different areas for many decades and who lived through the changes that happened in New York City before the Americans with Disabilities Act and since. And so there's more information on our website. It's nycdisabilityrightsarchive.org, and there's a couple of links that I'll refer to in the next slides. You can go ahead and go to the next one. So this is a photo of a small exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York. We were lucky enough to have a few objects from our archive featured in a new disability rights case study in their ongoing Activists New York exhibition. So this little display opened in July 2023. And so this photo is some of the members of our advisory board. We have other members as well. So on the left bottom is Car Massey, and she's kind of a legend in the disability community here. She's 92 years old and a fiercely independent person who has been active for her entire adult life. I'm to the right of her, and next to her is Peggy Gross, who was really the individual that initiated this whole process. And then Warren Shaw is standing behind her. He's a historian of disability history, and his father was one of the earliest commissioners for the Mayor's Office of the Handicapped, is what it was called at the time. It's now the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. And then Susan Abdulezer, who also worked in the Department of Education with Peggy. So Peggy Gross, I will give you a little bit of the background. I met her through my transportation advocacy work. She had recently retired from the Department of Education, where she was the director of travel training for the special education district in the Department of Education. So she really pioneered this idea of travel training for youth and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, first through a nonprofit called AHRC. And then later, she brought this program to the Department of Education and directed it for more than 40 years. And through her work with government agencies and nonprofit groups around the country and around the world, she helped other places to replicate this kind of training program so that people could travel independently using public transportation. She also considers herself to be an amateur historian. And through our conversations, she told me, I have this stuff and I think it's historically significant, but I have no idea where to put it. And so that kind of started the conversation. And she also knew these other influential individuals who probably also had stuff that needed to be preserved. And so that's what kicked off the conversation. And the first place was to find a home for this archive. And so we were lucky enough to have a receptive person at the College of Staten Island, James Kaiser, who's the archivist there. And, space was not a problem. And he was kind of open to it as long as we could find some funding for it. And so you can go to the next slide, please. So this is a kind of a timeline of what we've done since we started this. So in 2021, we wrote the initial State Archives grant, and we're funded for the Documentary Heritage Program to document this history. In 2022, we conducted an informal survey, just word of mouth and in the community to find out who else had stuff out there. And then we published a 3-year plan for documenting the disability rights history in New York City. And then since then, we've collected approximately half of the known materials, or around 33 cubic feet of mostly text documents, some photographs and other objects. And this year, we're trying to finish the arrangement and description of what we've collected, and we're in the process of applying for funding to digitize as many of these records as we can, depending on copyright, et cetera. Next slide, please. So what exactly are we documenting? When we sent out the survey, we asked if people had documents of activities like protests, organizing, campaigns, lobbying, lawsuits, et cetera, conducted by disabled people, their parents and caregivers, professionals working with them, individual advocates or disability advocacy organizations, groups and clubs, any records of organizing by people who were disabled, and we tried to include as many types of disability, which because these groups can tend to be a little bit siloed. So people who are physically disabled, blind and or low vision, deaf or with hearing loss, people with psychiatric disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, And we're especially interested in these activities that happened before there was like a coordinated disability rights movement. And we're also looking for the records of institutional practices of, like the government organizations that disabled people were trying to change. And so this is a lot of stuff at the city, local, and so often state level as well. Next slide, please. And so what have we found? This, disability tends to kind of touch every part of life. So we've found a lot of stuff around transportation access, which is a really critical disability rights area. And so when we talk about transportation access, we're talking about subways, buses, and paratransit on the public transit side, but also taxis and for-hire vehicles, ferries, sidewalks and curb cuts, accessible pedestrian signals, which are when you push a button and it makes sound and tells you when it's safe to cross, and also train and air travel. We've also found documents of people pushing for independent living, meaning that they can stay in the community rather than be institutionalized in nursing homes. Information about people fighting for education rights, healthcare and home care, architectural access to all types of buildings, homes, schools, and businesses, especially, but also churches and really any place. Civic access, which means getting access to government buildings, making sure that voting rights are ensured, having representation in the government, and also disability pride and media representation, fights for arts inclusion or representation, access to parks and playgrounds, and sports access and inclusion. And there's probably a couple of topics that I may have forgotten, but as you can see, it's very broad. Next slide, please. And what challenges have we encountered? So, the archive is definitely not like a complete history. It's a little bit fragmented because, when we kind of did this initial survey, a lot of people just didn't hold on to stuff. And so, and other people, they may have donated records or to a different archive somewhere else, which is great. At least it's preserved. But if people wanted to find all the disability history, they're probably not going to find it all within our archive. Some donors have been reluctant to part with the materials, so many times there have been many more conversations than I initially anticipated would be necessary to get the materials. And initially, some of our advisors disagreed with the location of the materials and said, Staten Island is just too hard to get to, and the process that we had to go through to first preserve the physical records and then catalog them and organize them and then digitize them later. So they kind of wanted to skip ahead to making stuff available immediately, even if it was copyrighted. So we had some initial disagreements about that. And a challenge that's going to be ongoing for us is just that long-term sustainability depends on outside funding for our institution. Next slide, please. And so going back to the history or the archive being a little bit fragmented, what I have been trying to do is, because every time I kind of meet with advisors, they'll kind of, say a few names or like, oh, have you contacted this organization? And so I had to kind of try to organize that. And so we've been kind of building this database of important organizations, government agencies, offices, and committees, and key and notable people that have been involved in this fight. So even though it's a fragmented history, we're trying to kind of record and organize whatever information we can find. And it's an ongoing process, but this spreadsheet is also available on our website. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think that's really all I have. And I think we're going to do questions after the next presentation, if I'm not mistaken. But
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Jessica.
yep, thank you.
I'm going to go right ahead and toss it to Caroline and Jessica Terry Elliott. Caroline, if you're able to, could you give us a quick introduction of yourself before you two start with your slides?
Sure. Hello, everyone.
Fantastic.
I'm so sorry. My computer seems to have crashed Zoom, so I'm on my phone, but thank you all. My name is Caroline Charles. I'm a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, also a member of the Turning the Lens collective, which we're going to talk a bit about today. And I met Jessica while doing an archival exhibition in the special collections here at Syracuse University and Byrd Library. So I have been involved in archival work through my own research, but also by working as a curatorial assistant with Jessica and in coming up with this project, which we're going to introduce you all to today. So Jessica, do you want to get started?
Sure. So today's presentation is focused on our project. First, our name is the Turning the Lens Collective, and we kind of grounded ourselves with that name because we are choosing to do this project through the lens of photography and seeing how Black life is not only documented, but how it is preserved. So the title of this project is Black Family Photography in Syracuse, assembling a community collection with family photo sharing. Ideally, this project is initially born from Caroline and my work, looking at just photography that existed within the archival space of Special Collections Research Center. We chose to include some of that photography in that exhibition, but then we started thinking about the stories that photography tells and the stories that it doesn't tell, and how photography can be an entry point into stories that are untold. I think for us, a large part of this project is kind of echoing the voices that are relative to communities that don't always find themselves in archival repositories, but always find themselves in domestic repositories. And there's a huge difference between those two things in terms of accessibility, right? In terms of visibility, in terms of value, and in terms of, again, creating a more holistic narrative of people, places, events, and spaces. What you see on the screen, working from left to right of the screen, is myself, Caroline, one of our source assistants, and one of our participants that we're working very closely with in this project. In the middle, you have 3 participants at the very beginning of this project, and then all the way at the end, you have myself kind of doing this business of doing a photo share and kind of telling the audience that we had who this person was in the photo, and kind of giving a story as to the person in the photo and their life experiences. Next slide, please. Caroline?
Yeah, so again, Jessica and I are part of the Turning the Lens collective, which also includes Professor Roger Hallis in the English department here at SU. We also have source assistants, one that you saw, Lorelei, Maya, Madison, Anaya, and Saria. And we also work closely with an advisory board of participants, as well as library professionals and other local residents that support us in our work. And one of our biggest goals, I think, is to create a sort of living archive of Syracuse history that can be used in curriculum, in local curriculum, that can be shared with the community, but also that the community itself participates in creating. So we're going to talk more about some of the strategies that we've used to ensure that the work that we do isn't this sort of top-down collecting of materials, but is really co-created and comes from the community we have here, which is important to Jessica and I because we are from Syracuse, New York. So we can go to the next slide. Nope, it didn't show. No. Oh, you can't see. That's all right.
That's okay. Yeah, that's all right. This is one of our participants. This is the amazing Mr. Charles Vanderpool, who we've been working with very closely within this documentary heritage program. Within this part of the project, we are conducting a series of interviews with Mr. Vanderpool, but like interview seems very formal, and it's very much so the technical side of what we're doing. But you know, if you were able to, which you will be able to soon, see these videos that we've done with Mr. Vanderpool, you will see just not only how candid he is, but how warm and how intimate kind of these interviews kind of are. So it's not like really an interview, it's almost like we're myself, Caroline, our source assistant, and Roger Hallis, we go to his house and we visit, and he shares pictures with us. And not only is he sharing pictures with us, but he's telling us stories of our home, right? So he's born in Syracuse. Myself, Caroline, are born in Syracuse. And if you're looking at pictures, what you start to realize and notice is that Syracuse doesn't look the same anymore. It's not the same space. It's not the same landscape. And so when you have access to the methodology of oral history, and you can couple oral history with photographs, you have a beautiful kind of story that not only is relegated to the oral histories, but now you have photographic evidence of what this person is saying. Not that their stories need to be corroborated, right? Because that's a conversation for another day. But what we are doing is allowing people kind of this platform to just share the things that they know, that they love, that they've seen, and that they've experienced on a larger platform. It's not just, you know, them within their families or within their close circles. Now it is a history of our city that we get to share far and wide, which is super, super important as we still navigate these changes, and we witness a changing landscape to the city of Syracuse, even until this day.
Yeah, and just to add to what Jessica just said, the collection itself, as you see here, we're doing recorded oral history interviews, video recorded. We're also scanning family photographs from participants, and we're also creating portraits of our participants posing with their family photographs. So the photo sharing that we're going to talk a little bit more about too is part of the documentation that we're doing. So paired with the sort of collection of the scanned photographs themselves, we have participants like Mr. Vanderpool talking about those photographs in the recordings, which we find really important, and a really important part. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, I don't know why they're not showing. So a really important part of the process is photo sharing methodology. And this is a methodology that we learned in collaborating with the Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling back in October 2023. And as Jessica mentioned earlier, it's this practice of sharing the photographs that exist in our sort of domestic repositories and sharing the oral histories behind them. So with that, we have photo sharing within the oral histories that we've been collecting to be a part of the collections, but it's also an important part of how we build relationships with the community. Also sort of practice collaboration and social cohesion. And it's also, I guess, how we introduce ourselves to the participants that we're working with. And you can go to the next slide.
So right now, we're at a phase in our work where we are expanding to build relationships with the elders within the community. Myself, Caroline, and Roger, we have a really a good understanding that, you know, for a lot of just historical purposes, we have to connect with the people who have these lived experiences, and we're kind of working on a limited amount of time. So what we've kind of done is we've opened this relationship with various organizations throughout the Syracuse community, namely Pieces Foster Grandparent Program, both at two different locations within the city of Syracuse, but also getting participants through independent, you know, kind of relationships and building participatory collections with, I guess, word of mouth. I guess that's the best way to put it. But within this kind of, I guess, participant pool, there are a host of people who have these very large stories that not only they want to share, but need to share. And also within that, we do this work of coupling the elders with sometimes students from Syracuse University to help students at Syracuse University understand this kind of intergenerational work that needs to be done. And I think a large part of that intergenerational work that needs to be done is just helping them understand that they are literally standing on shoulders of people that have come before them. And truth be told, I think that the elders that we couple them with feel good, right? They feel seen, they feel heard, they feel all of these different things, but more importantly, they begin to see themselves as creators of history, just like we do. And I think for, you know, to circle back to Caroline's, one of her initial points is that this project is not rooted in a top-down kind of methodology, but instead it's doing this work of balancing in the middle, understanding that large events happen, right? And we tell them from a very specific kind of vantage point, but also honoring the subjectivity within those events and the humanity within those events. There are real people who have experienced these real changes that have happened in Syracuse. A lot of them are older and have not yet had the opportunity to share their stories, or share their familiar stories, or share their migration stories, or share their current stories and their current positions. And what we want to do is we want to be able to provide them with not only a space to share those stories, but build community with us and build community amongst themselves. I think that's one of the beautiful parts about this project, is that it is collaborative from start to finish. It is collaborative not only with myself, Caroline, Roger, our source assistants, but it's also collaborative with us within community organizations and the people that we walk into this project. And a lot of times, people hear about this project from other people and they want to be involved. So now we're at this point where we have a collection of people, but we're realizing how long it takes to do this work correctly. And we want to be able to honor those stories in a way that is not only meaningful for us, but meaningful for the community as a whole. You can go to the next slide.
Next slide. Did it change to the next slide?
No, I'm still on this slide.
Yeah.
Okay, we go.
Okay, great. So one of the ways, again, that we have continued to build community, but also to celebrate the people that have contributed to the collection, is to have oral history celebrations at the Community Folk Art Center, which is another sort of partnering organization that has been very helpful to us throughout this process. And last year we did a presentation where members from the foster grandparents that we had been working with came and they talked about their photographs and talked with Jessica and an audience about their photographs and, you know, what it meant to be contributing to this collection. And we're going to be having another one of these events in April, on April 25th at the Community Folk Art Center again. But But I think this strategy is, again, a great way to sort of joyfully celebrate the work that we're doing, but again, to honor the fact that this is a collaborative effort, and that the history that we're trying to put together is something that we want the community to be able to share in. So using, again, like photo sharing, pairing our collecting with public events like this as we're building it, has been a really wonderful way to ensure that we are collaborating and honoring our participants. And I think go to the next slide, but Jessica, if you have any final words.
So no, I
Thank
don't
you.
think I have any final words. I just want to thank everyone for coming to today's presentation and kind of engaging in various ways with the work that is being done in Syracuse.
Thank you. So we have time for questions before Jessica Marie leaves. I have questions, but first we're going to open it up and ask folks. You can put them in the chat. You can put them in that anonymous question catcher. You can literally raise your hand and ask a question. So we'll give it a beat for folks to get organized. Well, I have a question and I'll start with it. And this one is, I'm going to focus on Jessica Marie first. But my question really kind of focuses on how did you guys build in ways to keep vulnerable people safe? So this is a big part of, making the invisible visible. And, people with disabilities have been vulnerable to prejudice, discrimination, financial abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse. I mean, like just all kinds of experiences that have made it hard for them to like take up space, right? And so I wonder how did you in this project build out ways for people to feel comfortable, for people to feel like they could extend their vulnerability and share as part of this project, and or anything else you want to share about vulnerability?
Yeah, I think for the most part, the people that have wanted to donate their records really want their history to be more visible. So I think, yeah, I think the vulnerability kind of comes in when it's these are records that people have held on to for whatever reason it's important to them. Sometimes it's not stuff that they themselves created, but it was stuff that they kept and preserved because it was important to them. And I think the vulnerability has kind of come through in trying to build trust, and so that because it's like we're saying we want to make this archive. It doesn't exist yet, but we want to take your stuff and make it available to other people. So that process actually does require a lot of trust building. And so, I kind of alluded to it, that some of the challenges were getting people to part with their stuff, because there are these emotional ties to the struggles that they've been involved in. And me, as someone that they don't know very well, coming in and just saying, give that to me and I'll trust me, it's like, it's not that straightforward. So a lot of it is just listening, being willing to be challenged, to answer questions, and to kind of commit to making sure that I see this project through to the end, even if I can't make any guarantees, saying that I'm not going to give up on it until what it's in the form that you envision it. And so a lot of that has dealt with the issues of, can people get access to it once it's there at Staten Island? You know, it's going to be hard for people to make their way out there, especially if they're disabled. And so that has not been lost on me at all. So I think committing to saying like we you know, the end product is so that people can access it remotely. And so there is vulnerability in that as well, because, you know, it's like if these are somewhat personal records or correspondences, making sure that people are okay with that stuff being public. So kind of, even though may have signed over copyright to things that they created, checking back in and making sure that they're okay once we move to this digitization phase. But ultimately, it is about building relationships and making sure that people see you as trustworthy, but also being trustworthy and showing up and helping and doing whatever the things are that are needed to get, you know, the physical acquisition of the materials. And so a lot of times that was going into people's homes. And so how do I make sure that in that space that they feel comfortable having me there? And if that took 15 phone calls, that's what it took, you know. So that's yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know if that answers it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome. So I have actually the same question essentially for Jessica, Terry Elliott, and for Caroline. And then we'll pause the recording and ask, because now questions from the group are coming in. And those are, you know, better anonymous, not recorded. So, but my questions as a co-facilitator, I want in here, because this is a big piece for me, is this vulnerability piece. And I want folks to be able to look back on this as a resource. So Jessica and Caroline, I'd love to hear about anything that you all and your project partners did to help keep folks who are vulnerable safe, and also invite them into like a trustworthy, trusting, loving environment to share really intimate photos of their lives and their families.
So I think for myself and for Caroline, we have kind of an unspoken advantage within our participatory community, because for a lot of them, there is a sense of pride that is bestowed upon me and Caroline. And sometimes it can be like it can be a bit daunting, but they are super proud of the work that we are doing. And they understand its importance more than anybody. I would say probably they understand its importance more than we do. So with this idea of acknowledging their vulnerability, I think we have very important conversations of what it means to be African American. And we have kind of this conversation, both sometimes explicitly and also implicitly, about what it has meant to be African American in the city of Syracuse, New York. What has that history looked like? And then confronting that history very open and honestly. And a lot of times for our participants, myself and Caroline, we take a back seat and we listen, because we don't have those same experiences as our participants. And that does the work of kind of decentering us and placing them within the driver's seat of how our interviews and oral histories are going to go, but also making them comfortable with the stories in which they're going to share. For a lot of people, this particular project, you know, we have a very long history of displacement in Syracuse. And when we talk about instances of displacement, we have to talk about what our participants have actually experienced. And that leads us into conversations about what they have been able to preserve. And for a lot of them, they are waiting for the opportunity to share not only the stories, but the photographic evidence or the newspaper clippings or other ephemera that goes with their memories. So it's kind of like a strong combination of us not being, you know, as we sometimes can be, academics kind of take the charge when we're doing a project. For us, myself for myself and Caroline, we've understood from the outset to sometimes you have to just be quiet and you have to listen to the people who have actually done the work of living the history that we are now set to not only research, but we are kind of stewards of documenting. So protecting them in that way, and making sure that what we are asking and what we are doing of them, it doesn't come off as authoritative, but instead it's a collaboration, but we are the small fish in this pond.
That's great. Thank you. Leah, I'm going to ask, can you please pause our recording? All right. So I'm just going to take a minute and talk about, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about process. And so our team created a tool to help with process, because really the beginning of process is conversations. So we'll have another Q&A period, but for now we're gonna go through a few slides and then we'll have a chance to practice what's on the slides. So how do we actually do this? We start with the three pieces of our objective today, right? Question and identify whose stories are missing from our collections. Discern which of our contemporary communities are visible and which are invisible, and keep vulnerable communities safe while still collecting materials that tell their stories. While we were in one of our Q&As that wasn't recorded, we talked about some more about vulnerability, but we also have that just right before this in our conversation about vulnerability. So in order to actually meet these objectives and answer these questions, we have to break them down into more detailed questions. And that will help us guide the work in our organizations. So before we can question and identify whose stories are missing from our collections, first we have to ask ourselves, what do our vision and mission charge us to accomplish? Who lives in our community and who uses our organization? And just as a reminder, you get to decide who lives in your community, or who your community is, right? So your community might be the neighborhood that you're in, the city or town. It could be all of New York State. It could be the East Coast. It's really, you decide your catchment area. You have to decide, do you have relationships with these communities? If you do, are they strong relationships? If you don't, how do you build relationships? If you have relationships, but they're not as strong as you want them, how do you fortify those relationships? And then finally, what's in your collection and who contributed to developing the collection? Once we answer those questions, we can move on to discerning which of our contemporary communities are visible and which are invisible. So where do the details of our community diverge from the details of our collections? Or put another way, who is represented in our collection? And can we reinterpret parts of our collections to include previously excluded communities? So in our January program of this year, we talked a lot about data. And I encourage you to go back and watch that mini webinar, because that gives you a really good starting place for understanding who's in your community, who actually is part of your community, and to then find out, are they represented in your collection? And then in 2023, we co-facilitated a program with some folks from Historic Huguenot Street. And they gave a really cool example of reinterpreting parts of their collections to include previously excluded communities. So Historic Huguenot Street shifted from telling like the colonizer story of the French Huguenots who settled there to telling the stories of the enslaved people who were enslaved in those historic buildings. And they've done a ton of work over the past many years to help bring those stories to life. And part of that was this linen cabinet that's in one of their houses. And you can hear more about that in the 2023 program we did with them. But essentially, they went from interpreting it as, look at this cool piece of furniture. It really showed how wealthy the family is, or the family was that had this cabinet, to literally everything about this piece of furniture and in it is related to enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. And how can we understand the wealth of colonizers through the enslaved people who actually were the ones building the wealth of these people? So you don't necessarily have to have a new object. You can look at an old object and read it against the grain, or you can look at archival material that you've had for a long time. You just read it against the grain. We talk a lot about that too in many of our other programs. And then finally, we have to understand what it means to keep vulnerable communities safe while adding their material culture to our collections. So we have to understand which communities are vulnerable. We have to understand which of these vulnerable communities have we excluded from our collections or failed to interpret as part of our collection. What relationships do we have with these communities? How can we establish or steward the relationships? And then how can we keep them safe? How do we protect their privacy, anonymity? How do we engage in non-compliance if they're threatened? And how do we engage in reciprocity with these communities, as well as anything else you can think of, right? Like, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's the list we want you to start with to think about, what does it mean? Leah, if you could put the link in the chat to the tool that has this, we're gonna practice with that in just a moment. But I did just want to shout out, because we are living in a time where many of us are concerned about protecting vulnerable communities while still engaging them. The New York State Governor and Attorney General's office, in partnership, released some guidance for that, and that will be in our resource list that we send out next week. So keep an eye out for that, but it really touches on that anonymity and non-compliance piece of keeping people safe. And Leah, I think you are good to stop our recording.